Good morning. My name is Shana Jones. I'm with the Carl Vinson Institute of Government at the University of Georgia. And I'm pleased to talk to you about a project that Scott Pippin and I worked on with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science called Stabilizing the Edge, Southeastern and Mid-Atlantic Shorescapes Facing Sea Level Rise. And it was a multi-interdisciplinary project. It was very much designed with the idea of trying to think about the human and natural system together and how humans affect the natural system, of course, but also how the natural system informs human behavior too. And so we had scientists looking, of course, at marshes and birds and fish and erosion and all of those elements. And then we had social scientists looking at people, why they do what they do. And then they had us as lawyers looking at the policy and governance systems. And so today I'll talk briefly about shorelines and sea level rise, but then turn to shoreline management, what we're doing, and then some of the project designs and findings with respect to our legal analysis. Many of you have seen these projections before. The point I want to make here is that we are hitting the curve going up. And for the purposes of our study, if you think about, we might be looking at, this is 2 feet of sea level rise by 2050, and say a place like Norfolk, you can see a tremendous amount of inundation. And for the non-scientists, you may be surprised, the scientists may be surprised to hear this, but for lawyers, there's a lot of opportunity to include legal analysis in these kind of modeling scenarios too. Where are the jurisdictional lines? What would make a difference? Before we can kind of make those policy considerations of changing how we do things, we first need a baseline of what are we doing now with the law. And that's in large part what our project was about. Sorry. And so we're looking at really, NOAA's encouraging this, certainly the Georgia Coastal Resources Division is encouraging planning for a high or intermediate high scenario. And when you think about what that looks like in 2050, 1.5 meters is significant. And we always want to make the point is, well, it looks like that's out in the future. That's only less than 30 years from now, and most mortgages are 30 years. So if you bought a house in some of these areas now, you could be looking at a significant level of sea level rise. But of course, when you look at sea level rise, that's just global. That's like the consolidated projections and what's happening on a global basis. Relative sea level rise is important as well. Sea level rise, of course, varies due to the location, tides, storm surge, weather systems, other processes. And there's significant differences in trends that vary by region or even by localities. So the point for this is that climate adaptation involves thinking about short-term variations in sea level as well as long-term trends. And also it's going to be very local. And so we're seeing sea level rise isn't just going to affect us in the future, it's happening now. And we're seeing that with what NOAA calls high tide flooding. Sometimes you hear it called king tide flooding, or sometimes you hear it called nuisance flooding. But this is the tide gauge in Fort Pulaski. These are the current observations of flooding that occurs during the day. It's not rain, it's just high tide. It's coming through the stormwater system. And we're seeing a lot more of this happening. And what's happening is actually tracking with this extreme scenario. So when you project out, say to 2050, and you're in this intermediate scenario, you could be looking at a place that has between 150 and 200 days of high tide flooding. That means water in the street. That means limited access sometimes over causeways. That means a lot of infrastructure repair. So something we need to be thinking about, and it's happening now. So what are we going to do? And this is a really nice graphic from the Corps of Engineers. We're doing all of these things and we will continue to do these things. There's a whole spectrum of addressing flooding and sea level rise, from evacuation when we have storms, relocating people, acquiring houses, elevating buildings, building flood walls, stabilizing our shorelines, etc., beach restoration, all kinds of things. What we focused on for the purposes of our article and for the purposes of this project was the shoreline stabilization choices on the estuarine side. So we're looking very much at living shorelines, all of these kinds of efforts to stabilize the shore in this way. And, I just want to make a point that we're working very closely with the Corps' Engineering with Nature program in partnership with the Institute of Resilient Infrastructure Systems at the College of Engineering. And the idea is that we're going to need structures that look like this, that incorporate both built elements, say reef balls, concrete reef balls, bagged oyster shells, with natural elements in order to stabilize our shorelines. And these are just some of the values and what Noon is looking to do. We want to have rigorous methods and standards. We want to assess the benefits and costs. We want to choose the right things in the right places. Everything isn't going to work everywhere. We've got to monitor performance, understand the outcomes, and we do need to integrate this people and policy element. And so we're very excited that this work that we've done with FIMS also complements, hopefully, some of the work we're doing with Noon. So very much, let's focus. There's so much nature-based infrastructure we could talk about, a lot of shoreline stabilization we could talk about, but in our paper, primarily, we really are thinking about bulkheads versus living shorelines. These things are used more on the marsh side, estuarine side. And this illustration, represents Georgia's coastal ecology. And you can really see how a bulkhead is built in such a way where it's flat, usually and graded. It's more like a bathtub. The water goes up and down, and that's how it works. A living shoreline is designed to be more dynamic, allow the tide to come in and out. Oyster shells are used as a stabilization and erosion control device. And, what I also want to point out here is that the protection is the same, right? We still have the same line of trees. We still have the same amount of parcel here, but there's a more dynamic ability for the tide to flow. So this is the idea behind living shorelines. And, for the most part, they are better. Bulkheads are engineered. So are living shorelines, but the difference is they're focused on restoring the natural habitat using structural and non-structural elements, whereas bulkheads are just designed to create that flat surface and control erosion. Bulkheads are perceived as durable. We're used to them. We feel comfortable with walls, but they can be damaged in large storm events, and they can erode on the other side, so they're not perfect. And living shorelines have been shown to attenuate wave energy better than bulkheads. Sometimes bulkheads can actually increase erosion locally, and living shorelines tend to reduce it. And certainly bulkheads decrease habitat quality for estuarine species. They're not nearly as good for fish. They're not nearly as good for birds. They're not nearly as good for critters. And so living shorelines are increasingly shown not only to not impair natural processes, but actually there's some science coming out of our project showing that they can even improve them. So here's just two pictures of what we're talking about. Here's a bulkhead on Skidaway Island and a living shoreline on Tybee Island, Georgia. So these are pictures. I want to be clear that we're not trying to advocate living shorelines everywhere. There's going to be a role for both hard armoring and soft armoring and hybrid combinations of the two. But I think it's still important to realize that they are different, and one is not necessarily, what we're used to is not necessarily better. We're just used to it. So what did we do? How do lawyers contribute to this process? So what we did, our research agenda was to examine the shore protection laws and policies in 7 states, starting from Delaware all the way to Florida. And we were looking at setbacks, and those are the areas where you have to build structures backwards. And then we were looking at how we manage shoreline stabilization approaches. And we looked at both ocean-facing, the beach, and estuarine areas as well, because we thought that comparative would be informative. We could learn some things maybe from one area of management that could inform the other, and that turned out actually to be the case. So what was our premise? We think adaptation will require a comprehensive understanding of these frameworks. If we're going to update them, we need to know what they are. We think outlining these frameworks could set the stage for integrating these boundaries with science-based modeling efforts. We could see maybe if we may think that changing a setback, for example, is going to make a big difference. Maybe we should model that and see if that's the case, especially with sea level rise projections. So there's an opportunity to better integrate law and policy in our modeling. We wanted to outline and characterize them. How can we talk about them as groups, as categories? What are the kinds of things we do? Believe it or not, we didn't find a lot of research or efforts to do that. And then, for better or worse, law is notoriously path dependent. It builds on past decisions and approaches. That's how the law works. That's the way we go. Even when we pass new laws, even when we start over and create new laws, they are often informed by things we've done from the past. So very likely whatever we do on the shore is going to be informed by what we do now. So the big picture, the majority of the ocean-facing shore protection laws have established jurisdictional lines based on erosion rates. And this does allow for more adaptive management driven by scientific data. More explicit acknowledgement and accounting for sea level rise will be necessary in many areas. Most of the states, in fact, almost all of them except for Delaware, don't really acknowledge sea level rise in how they draw their boundaries. They may say it in certain places, but actually how they draw those boundaries, it's less, not mentioned much, even though there may be ways to do it through words such as future conditions. And what we're seeing actually is a little bit of hardening of some of these ocean-facing boundaries. And this seems like a human response, perhaps to sea level rise. It's understandable, but a little concerning. And certainly managers both on the ocean-facing side and on the marsh side should be, aware of this kind of holding the line trend we're seeing in the law. So, and I should say all of this is in a recent law review article that just appeared in the Columbia Journal of Environmental Law. So you could read all of this in great detail and not just take my word for it of what we found. We looked at all the states. This is kind of an example of how they look. We draw our ocean-facing boundaries by looking at elements that are seaward, high water lines, states differ on where they start, and then often adding on top of that seaward line projection rates, and then drawing a line that is a landward line, usually at the toes of dunes, or maybe, depending how far back it goes, and then saying you can put your building here. So that's generally how we do it on the ocean side. And it matters, right? This is a nice graph from 2017. You can really see that looking at erosion rates can change the setback distance. In some places in South Carolina, it looks like you need 819 feet. In other places, you only need 20 feet or 136 feet. And this is science informing policy in a really interesting way and actually informing where this should be. This is not normal, right? These are not most jurisdictional lines. When you think about property, or draw them where they're drawn, they're surveyed where they're surveyed, and that's it. State borders are the same, but the ocean is dynamic. Waterways are dynamic. So incorporating erosion rates into these ocean jurisdictional lines really reflects that dynamism and is good. But it makes it hard. We don't love dynamism necessarily because change is difficult, particularly when you have significant investments, particularly when you have property. And South Carolina is struggling with this a little bit. They updated their Beach Management Act to abandon their kind of policy of retreat. The act still has lots of wonderful things in it. I don't want to suggest it doesn't, but it's definitely reflecting some of these changes, some tension between how they're going to draw their jurisdictional lines. In South Carolina, they are required to relook at their jurisdictional lines. And the short story is, the law review article goes into it much more detail. South Carolina is in a place where there's multiple jurisdictional lines that folks essentially seem to be able to choose based on when they were drawn. Was it a pass line? Was it drawn a certain way? And this picture from their shoreline bureau kind of shows the interesting outcome and the choices that are available based on different policies. So this is probably going to happen elsewhere, and we need to be aware of that. On the estuarine side, we found, of course, that buffers are a common way to protect the resource, and includes permitting programs that are traditional to wetlands, and then licensing control of state-owned water bottoms because people are building out there. So it's a little different, right, from the ocean-facing side in that the lines are measured from natural features. There's going to be a description of all the marsh grasses in the state and how you draw from those. So it's very different from the beach side. And here's just an example. I won't go through it all, but you can read in the article of what all the states do. We looked at it all comprehensively. And the big picture I want to make, and a lot of y'all may know this, but certainly I would say, most lawyers may not know this, or folks working in policy, is that sea level rise may affect these marsh areas more than even on the beach side. And that's important because we found that erosion rates or sea level rise right now is not incorporated into these jurisdictional determinations. Even for shoreline armoring projects, they're intended to address erosion or flooding. And climate change is going to affect these areas too, and perhaps even more than the ocean-facing side. So really learning from the ocean-facing regulations that we have, maybe our marsh laws, our estuarine protection laws also need to use more local data that's regularly updated to allow for more nuanced management. So this picture of Tybee is a really great picture. You'll see the sea level rise adaptation plan. This part of the island is relatively unscathed by sea level rise, but all of the inundation is going to occur on the back end. And that's not intuitive, and our regulations right now reflect that. So I know I'm getting close to time, just lots of interesting details kind of from big picture. Of course, many of the values in these acts, we want them to look at them. They all say we're going to protect habitat and dunes and beach access and recreation, economic development and hazard mitigation. All of those are wonderful values, and they're great. Beach protection acts tend to be more hazard protection, tourism, recreation. That makes sense. They're understood as being really hit by hurricanes in a way. And so you see that. Whereas your estuarine areas are really informed by kind of wetlands protection or preventing their despoilization, which is great, but it doesn't always, they often don't describe how they can value for flood control, or certainly there's not the same understanding or representation of that in most of these laws. And very quickly, as wonderful as all those values are, courts have a really hard time balancing them with economic interest in private property rights, right? In the end, it's in this case really puts the dilemma well. Courts feel like they're measuring the unmeasurable and comparing the incomparable. So you can get what it's going to cost a homeowner. You can see that and you can understand that. What's the value of aesthetics? How do you balance those things? And then the private property interest is often very, very compelling. And so this case really, while the court saw the dilemma, it ultimately said, well, the private property owner has to put sandbags on the beach. And if people don't have access, they can go to another part of the beach and access the beach there. And if it looks bad, well, they can, the aesthetics is only bad here, they can look elsewhere. And ultimately protecting this property is more important for this issue. And so this is a great case describing that dilemma. The other thing that we saw a lot, obviously, is while we have all these values and they're great, in the end, when we are talking about shoreline stabilization permitting, we're talking about controlling erosion. And that is probably the most important value in all of these statutes. In the end, that's why they exist, is to let people get permits to control the edge of their property. And so if you think about that, you can see if you're trying to promote living shorelines, if you're trying to promote other approaches, you're really going to need to help people be convinced that they control erosion as well as hard structures. That's just that's been our history for 50 years of permitting these things, and courts are going to want to see that, and property owners, that's why they're paying to do it. They're not paying to build a bulkhead to improve the water quality, they're paying to protect their property. So they're going to really want to need confidence that living shoreline does the job. And so what's interesting we found is that certainly states are promoting living shorelines. Certainly they want to see this happen, and there's lots more, incentives and legal ways to do it. But what we found is armored shorelines throughout our study area are often held to a lesser standard than nature-based shorelines. Living shorelines, you have to analyze the fetch and the bathymetry and the bank elevation and the tides, and all of that's really good. And we think that that should do that because living shorelines aren't going to work everywhere. But we don't do the same analysis for bulkheads, and they're not necessarily better. We just presume that they work. And so I think a question going forward is, why not hold them to the same standards? Why not use science to figure out what would be the best thing and promote that best thing, whether it's a bulkhead or whether it's a living shoreline? And I know I'm getting to the end. Just very quickly, lots of interesting law and policy related to neighbors. And I think there's a lot of fruitful areas of research here. There's a lot of policies designed to inform neighbors, designed to let them know what's going on. But really interesting to me is number 4, kind of these gap filling and shore alignment policies that actually promote hardened shorelines. And we need to think about these gap filling and alignment policies, I think, pretty hard, because it seems like, well, if 95% of your tidal creek's armored, why not fill the last one? Well, there's some science showing that there's good oasis effect, that critters can really thrive in some of these places, and it's good to have them. But I think, you're going to have more questions about, will those certain spots cause erosion with bulkheads next to them? And that's something we need to study. That's something we need to really look at so that we can kind of address these trends or these pressures to fill the gap between bulkheads with another bulkhead. And there's some wonderful analysis in our, with project partners that have done that. I recommend this paper. And there's been some wonderful research done in the state of Georgia. That's the Peterson article mentioned here. Neighbors really matter. People tend to do what their neighbors do. So if I have a living shoreline, I'm more likely to have a living shoreline. My neighbor, certainly if my neighbors have hard armoring, I am too. And knowing that, we really could understand that and perhaps have better policies addressing that, or have, broader planning. Instead of thinking parcel by parcel, how do you have policies or incentives for people to look at the tidal creek as a whole, or look at the watershed as a whole and make decisions and say, okay, we need to work together and figure out where the hard stuff needs to be and where the soft stuff can go, instead of doing it piecemeal. There's a lot of potential, I think, and change that will need to happen for that, but understanding incentives, helping people deal with the fact that they tend to do what their neighbors do. And the last thing, the kind of legal thing is, we think it should be more of a shorescape perspective. We make a lot of our decisions about shoreline stabilization parcel by parcel right now. And maybe this needs to be, we think it needs to be broader. We need to think the whole context is together. And you can think about traditional zoning in communities where, yes, you get to make decisions about your private property, but you also have to be part of a larger kind of zoning policy that your city has, or that your community has, or heck, sometimes even your homeowners association has, so that we all work together and make good land use choices together. And this could happen on the shore side too, we think. So thank you very much for your time. We want to think holistically. This is a great picture indicating that. My contact information is here, and my colleagues' contact is as well. Again, we have a law review article that you're welcome to read about all this in more detail.